There was once an empire so massive, so powerful, that at its peak it controlled over 44% of the entire world's population. Not Rome, not Greece, not China. This empire stretched from India in the east all the way to Greece in the west. It built the world's first postal system, the first universal currency, the first declaration of human rights. And today, the descendants of that empire live in a country that the Western world calls a threat, a rogue state that must be stopped. How does the greatest empire in history become the most feared country on Earth? If you only know Iran from the news, you know the ending. You've never actually met the character. Close your eyes for a second and go back, way back, about 2,500 years. Imagine a high plateau somewhere in Central Asia. The sky at night is impossibly clear. No city lights, just a sea of stars overhead. A dry wind moves through the rocky valley, carrying with it the faint smell of pine and spices from trading caravans passing through. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of hooves on gravel tells you that another caravan is cutting across the ancient trade routes that stretch from one end of the known world to the other. And in that landscape, one man is crouched over a map drawn in clay on the ground. A map bigger than any map anyone in that era had ever imagined. That man was Cyrus, king of Anshan, the man who would become the king of kings. He was dreaming of an empire the world had never seen. Around 550 BC, Cyrus II of Persia rose up against the Median Empire, the regional superpower of the time. Through a combination of military genius and diplomatic skill that was almost unheard of for his era, he conquered the Medes, then swept west to take Lydia, and finally, in 539 BC, he marched on Babylon, the wealthiest, most powerful city-state in the ancient world. Within the span of his 30-year reign, the Achaemenid Empire grew from a small Persian kingdom into the largest empire the world had ever seen. From the Indus Valley in the east to the Balkans and North Africa in the west. About 5.5 million square kilometers. More than 23 nations under one rule. Egypt, Babylon, Lydia, and dozens of Greek city-states. But what made Cyrus different from every other conqueror in history wasn't the size of his empire. It was what he did with the people he conquered. When Cyrus walked into Babylon as the victor, he didn't burn the city. He didn't execute the old rulers. He didn't force the Babylonians to abandon their gods and worship Persian ones. Instead, he freed people. The Jewish people who had been held captive in Babylon for decades were released. They were allowed to go home, allowed to rebuild their temple, protected in their right to practice their own religion. And the same went for every other group inside the empire. No one was forced to change their language, their religion, or their way of life. You just had to live peacefully and pay your taxes to the central government. Cyrus then had all of this carved onto a clay cylinder, what historians now call the Cyrus Cylinder. That small piece of clay is widely recognized as one of the earliest written records of the concept of human rights. Not in the modern legal sense, historians debate the exact framing, but in the sense that a ruler put into writing that the people he conquered deserved dignity and freedom of belief. In an era when conquest usually meant slaughter, enslavement, and the complete destruction of your culture, Cyrus did something almost incomprehensibly different. His successors kept building on that foundation. Under Cyrus the Great, the empire hit its absolute peak. The ceremonial capital, Persepolis, was built on a massive stone platform in what is now the Fars province of southern Iran. Towering columns reaching toward the sky, walls carved with reliefs showing representatives from every nation in the empire, each bringing tribute to the great king. Not images of slaves, images of citizens from dozens of different cultures showing up willingly. And here's the thing people miss about this empire. It wasn't just great because of its army. It was great because of what it built around that army. A royal road stretching over 1,500 miles that let messages travel from one end of the empire to the other in 7 days, in an era when a merchant caravan took months to make the same journey. A standardized gold coin called the daric that functioned as an early universal currency. Standard weights and measures used across all 23 nations. Essentially, they invented ancient globalization. The Persian Empire wasn't powerful despite its diversity. It was powerful because of it. The Achaemenid Empire lasted over 220 years, longer than the United States has existed today, before Alexander the Great of Macedonia finally brought it down in 330 BC. Persepolis was burned. Whether it was pure military conquest or a wine-fueled night of revenge is still debated by historians. But the land didn't die with the flames. Centuries passed. The Parthian Empire rose. Then the Sasanian Empire, which thrived for 400 more years. When Islam arrived in the 7th century AD, the Persian people didn't abandon their identity. They absorbed the new faith into it. They became Shia Muslim Persians, weaving together religious devotion with thousands of years of cultural pride. During the Golden Age of Islamic civilization, roughly the 8th through the 13th centuries, Persian scholars were at the absolute center of global knowledge. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, was a Persian physician whose medical textbooks were used in European universities for centuries. Al-Biruni calculated the Earth's circumference with frightening accuracy using medieval instruments. The poet Rumi left behind verse that people are still reading and quoting today in languages he never heard of, all of them from the same piece of land. By the 20th century, the land of Iran was ruled by the Qajar dynasty, a weakened royal family that had held the throne since 1789, slowly losing its grip under pressure from 2 European superpowers squeezing from both sides. Britain pushing in from the south, Russia expanding from the north. Ordinary Iranians watched with growing bitterness as the wealth of their ancient land got quietly shipped away piece by piece. One concession signed, one unfair contract forced through, foreign companies arriving as investors and leaving as owners. In 1891, the Qajar king sold the entire Iranian tobacco trade to a single British company in exchange for some cash flowing into the palace. The Iranian people rose up in protest and forced the deal to be cancelled. But the lesson wasn't learned. In 1901, the king's son did something even worse. He handed over the rights to drill for oil across the entire country to a foreign investor for 60 years. The land of the world's greatest empire was quietly becoming a place that other people mined for profit. And the most painful part wasn't losing the resources, It was being made to feel like you weren't capable of governing your own land. Like a royal dynasty's heir being told to sit quietly in the old house while strangers counted money in the living room. The pride of an extraordinary past, the pain of being exploited in the present. Those two things together are the most important keys to understanding Iran. Whether you're looking at Iran 100 years ago or Iran on the news today. The descendants of Cyrus never forgot who they were. They remembered that their ancestors had carved onto a piece of clay that every human being deserves the right to choose their own faith and live in freedom, at a time when the rest of the world was still operating in the dark. And they remembered that every time someone tried to erase that memory, this land had always found a way to fight back. This is Persia, the land that once defined the world, before the world tried to define it. What if the greatest empire in world history wasn't built on brutality? What if the secret to ruling 23 nations, over 44% of the global population, for more than 200 years, was actually tolerance? That's not a feel-good myth. That's what the archaeology tells us. When excavators dug through the ruins of Persepolis in the 1930s, they found tens of thousands of clay tablets buried in the rubble, administrative records, pay stubs, essentially. And what they showed was startling. Every single worker who helped build this city, regardless of where they came from, was paid. Persians, Babylonians, Greeks, Egyptians, same wage for the same skill level. No distinction based on ethnicity. In an era when the rest of the world ran on slave labor, the Persian Empire paid its workers. When Darius I took the throne after Cyrus in 522 BC, his first move was to restructure the empire so it could actually last. He divided the territory into provinces called satrapies, each one governed by a local administrator called a satrap, who reported to the king, but still allowed each region to operate by its own laws, speak its own language, and worship its own gods. This wasn't just good PR, it was genuinely revolutionary governance. Instead of forcing everyone to become Persian, Darius built a system that said, "Keep being yourself, just be part of something larger." To protect all of it, he created one of history's most legendary military units, the Immortals. 10,000 elite soldiers, hand-picked and perfectly equipped. The name came from the rule that their number could never drop below 10,000. The moment one fell in battle, a replacement stepped forward immediately. To their enemies, it looked like they literally could not be killed. Then came the Royal Road, over 1,500 miles of paved highway connecting the heart of the empire at Susa to the western coast at Sardis. Relay stations every 14 miles, fresh horses always waiting. A message could travel the entire length of the empire in 7 days. In an age when merchant caravans took months, this was genuinely unbelievable. And then Darius introduced something even bigger. A universal gold coin called the daric, along with standardized weights and measurements used across all 23 nations. Merchants from India could trade with merchants from Greece without needing to figure out exchange rates or conversion tables. Essentially, they created ancient globalization about 2,000 years before anyone invented the term. But the greatness of this empire wasn't something you could measure in miles of road or gold coins. Imagine standing in the market at Persepolis during the empire's peak. If you could be there. Right now, you'd hear at least 15 different languages echoing around you at the same time. Aramaic from Middle Eastern traders, Greek from philosophers who came seeking knowledge, Sanskrit from Brahmin scholars from the Indus Valley, Old Persian from the palace officials weaving through the crowd. The smell of Indian spices mixing with Arabian incense, mixing with wine from northern vineyards, all hanging in the dry, hot air of the Fars Plateau. This was the world the Achaemenid Empire built, a world with no cultural borders, a world where difference wasn't a reason for conflict, it was a source of wealth. Of course, not everyone stayed in line. The Greek city-states on the western edges of the empire were a constant headache. What most Westerners know as the Persian Wars, the legendary 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, Athens triumphing at Marathon, the brave, free people of Greece resisting Eastern tyranny, looks very different from the Persian side of the intent story. From Persia's perspective, the Greeks in Asia Minor were already under Persian governance. When Athens encouraged them to rebel in what historians call the Ionian Revolt around 500 BC, Darius didn't see it as defending freedom. He saw it as a foreign power interfering in internal affairs. The military campaigns that followed weren't conquest missions, they were punitive expeditions. And even though Persia lost at Marathon in 490 BC, Xerxes came back 10 years later and actually sacked Athens, burned it to the ground. The Athenians had to evacuate the entire city before Persian troops marched in. The ruins smouldered for weeks. This is the part that Western textbooks tend to rush past. The winners write history, and the history of the Persian Wars was written by Greeks. The Achaemenid Empire lasted over 220 years, longer than the United States has been a country. The end came in 330 BC, when Alexander the Great of Macedonia swept through, toppling satrapies one by one until he reached the capital itself. When Alexander walked into Persepolis, he reportedly stopped in his tracks. No city he'd ever seen came close to the grandeur of what stood in front of him. And then he burned it down. The story goes that on a night of drunken celebration, an Athenian woman in his company suggested they torch the city as revenge for what Xerxes had done to Athens. And Alexander, the greatest military mind of the ancient world, said yes. But here's what's fascinating about Alexander. The more he learned about Persia, the more he respected it. He adopted Persian court ceremonies, wore Persian clothes, married a Persian princess, ordered his Macedonian officers to marry Persian women. He even made a pilgrimage to the tomb of Cyrus at Pasargadae, read the inscription carved on the stone, and ordered it to be carefully restored. Even the man who destroyed the empire couldn't help admiring what it had been. That's the mark of something built on philosophy rather than just force. You can burn the buildings, you can't burn the idea. Centuries passed. The Parthian Empire rose, then the Sasanian Empire, 400 years of Persian Renaissance. Then Islam came in the 7th century, and the Persians absorbed it, not surrendering their identity, but weaving it into a new one. Shia Islam and Persian culture becoming so deeply intertwined that you could no longer separate one from the other. And through every single one of those transitions, conquest, occupation, conversion, revolution, one thing survived: a sense of self, a bone-deep pride in being the descendants of something extraordinary, a belief that this land was more than just geography, it was a civilization. That pride is a double-edged thing. When the empire is thriving, it feeds art, science, philosophy, and wise governance. But when the land is being exploited and its dignity ground underfoot, and that time was coming, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a fire that is almost impossible to put out because it doesn't burn in the ground, it burns in people. Iranian, generation after generation, grew up with the story of Cyrus, of Darius, of the empire that had once held the world in its hands, not as nationalism in the flag-waving sense, as something deeper, a quiet, unshakable feeling that something great had been taken from them and that one day it should come back. That feeling was still very much alive when a British businessman stepped off a boat in Tehran in 1901 with a briefcase full of contracts and a very generous offer for the king. There are moments in history where the fate of an entire country gets decided by a single signature. One morning in 1901, a British businessman named William Knox Darcy walked into the court of the Qajar king in Tehran. He didn't come with an army. He didn't come with threats. He came with a large wallet and a stack of papers written in dense legal language. By the end of that day, the contract was signed. The deal? £20,000 sterling in cash, another £20,000 in company shares, in exchange for the exclusive right to drill for oil across the entire territory of Iran for 60 years. Shah Muzaffar al-Din Qajar probably had no idea that the signature he pressed into that paper would change the course of Iranian history forever. Darcy spent 7 years searching for oil and came up empty. The money was running out, hope was fading. His field manager, George Reynolds, was days away from sending a telegram back to London ordering him to shut everything down and come home. But before that telegram went out, at a depth of 1,180 feet underground, in a town called Masjid Suleiman in the Khuzestan province, pressure built until it couldn't hold anymore. An explosion of sound, and then a thick black liquid shot upward into the pre-dawn sky. May 26, 1908. The first commercially significant oil discovery in the entire Middle East. It was the beginning of one of the most lopsided, exploitative relationships in modern history. In 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was officially incorporated. In 1914, the British government purchased 51% of the company's shares, making itself the controlling shareholder. The man who pushed hardest for that government purchase was Winston Churchill, then serving as First Lord of the Admiralty. He could see clearly that Iranian oil was the lifeblood that would power the British Royal Navy through whatever war was coming. He described what they'd found in Iran as a prize from fairyland beyond their wildest dreams. The British Royal Navy ran on Iranian oil through World War I. The greatest naval fleet on Earth was powered by fuel pumped out of someone else's land. And as the decades rolled by, Britain became more and more dependent on keeping control of that supply. The Royal Navy, the Treasury, the entire British standard of living, as the Shah of Iran himself would later remark, was essentially running on Iranian oil. And he wasn't wrong. The Abadan refinery on the banks of the Shatt al-Arab waterway was built in 1913 and within a few years became the largest oil refinery in the world. Picture Abadan in the 1930s, 40s and 50s. If you could stand there and look around, you'd see a city split into two completely separate worlds. On one side, the British residential zone. Green lawns carefully watered, clean white houses with electric fans, a sports club, a swimming pool, a school, a hospital. Everything a colonial employee needed to feel at home. On the other side, a neighborhood the locals called Kagazabad. In Persian, that literally translates to paper city. Iranian workers, thousands of them, living in shacks made from scrap materials. No running water, no electricity, standing water, rotting smells, and flies that never went away. Iranian workers who were drilling oil out of their own countries' ground were being paid 50 cents a day. No benefits, no healthcare, no housing. While British employees received full salaries, comfortable housing, and complete social amenities. This wasn't a business deal gone slightly unfair. This was colonialism with a legal contract stapled to the front. The original Darcy concession terms were almost offensively one-sided. The Iranian government received just 16% of profits, and the word profits was defined entirely by the company. Iran had no right to audit the books. Not a single accountant, not one independent review. On top of that, Iran couldn't sell its own oil directly to anyone. Everything had to go through the Anglo-Persian company. Iran couldn't even find out who was buying their oil or at what price. The British company controlled production, refining, shipping, and sales, a complete monopoly over every step of the chain. The actual owner of the land sat and waited for whatever number the company chose to report. When the Pahlavi dynasty replaced the Qajars in 1925, Reza Shah tried to renegotiate. Years of back and forth. The New Deal, signed in 1933, was in some ways even worse. It extended the concession all the way to 1993, meaning Britain would control Iranian oil for 60 more years. The New Deal still refused independent auditing. Iran was told to trust the numbers they were given. Scholars who studied the 1933 agreement later called it one of the greatest squandered opportunities in Iranian diplomatic history. The net profits of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company between 1945 and 1950 were nearly 3 times the total payments Iran received over the same period. The bitterness accumulated slowly, like an infected wound that keeps getting bandaged over without ever being properly cleaned. Iranian oil workers in Abadan went on strike in 1946, demanding better housing, fair wages, and basic compliance with Iranian labor law. The company refused every demand. The government sent in troops to break it up. Workers died. The fire that got stamped out that day didn't actually go out. It just kept burning underground, waiting. Think about what it felt like to be an ordinary Iranian in that era. You look out your window and see the orange glow of the refinery flare stacks burning all night. You know that's oil from land your ancestors walked on for thousands of years, but you don't have electricity to light a single bulb in your own home. You watch British tankers leaving the port at Abadan, one after another, carrying the wealth of your land to another country. And you have to walk half a mile to find clean drinking water. That feeling isn't just poverty, that's humiliation. What Britain never seemed to understand, or understand and simply not care about, was that Iranians weren't just citizens of a poor country grateful for whatever scraps got thrown their way. They were descendants of the empire that had governed 44% of the world's population, of kings who called themselves King of Kings of all the earth, of a civilization that had invented the concept of human rights before the West even had a word for it. Being treated like servants in your own homeland isn't just economic pain. It's a wound that goes all the way to the center of who you think you are. And in 1950, something happened that made the wound impossible to ignore anymore. Iran heard news that the Arabian-American oil company, Aramco, had just struck a new deal with the Saudi government, a 50-50 profit split, equal partnership. While Iran was still locked into the old terms, getting a fraction of what its oil was worth, Saudi Arabia had just negotiated its way to an equal share. The gap was now visible to everyone, and the pressure that had been building for 5 decades was about to find a release valve, in the form of a tall, elderly man in a suit who was about to stand up in Parliament and tell the world that Iranian oil belonged to Iran. There's a question Iranians have been asking for over 70 years. If Operation Ajax had never happened, what would Iran look like today? Nobody can answer it, but everyone agrees the question matters. Because what happened in August 1953 wasn't just a change of government. It was 2 powerful nations deliberately destroying another country's future to protect their own financial interests. In the early 1950s, with public anger at a boiling point across the country, one man stepped forward as the hope of the Iranian people. His name was Mosaddegh, a lawyer, a parliamentarian, an old man with wire-rimmed glasses and a sharp mind who happened to be one of the most beloved politicians in Iranian history. He wasn't a revolutionary, he wasn't a religious hardliner, he was a democrat who believed that a nation's natural resources should belong to its people. Mosaddegh had studied law in Europe, spoke fluent French, and understood international politics deeply. World leaders who dealt with him described him as sharp, principled, and hard to argue with. He held no fundamental hostility toward the West. He simply believed Iran deserved the same fairness any other nation would expect. And that straightforwardness was exactly what made him so dangerous to London and Washington. You couldn't argue against it without looking like a hypocrite. In April 1951, the Iranian parliament voted unanimously to nationalize the country's oil industry. Mosaddegh, elected prime minister that same month, was the driving force. The National Iranian Oil Company was established immediately, replacing the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Iranians poured into the streets to celebrate. For the first time in decades, the land was going to be governed by the people who actually lived on it. In London and Washington, the reaction was the opposite. Britain was furious. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, in which the British government held majority shares, was the backbone of their economy. They hit back hard and fast, pulling all British engineers and technicians out of Iran, organizing a global boycott of Iranian oil, pressuring every allied nation to refuse Iranian exports. British warships patrolled the Persian Gulf to intercept Iranian tankers. The major oil companies, all controlled by British and American interests, collectively refused to purchase Iranian crude. It was a wall built around Iran, designed to strangle it economically until Mosaddegh backed down. The Iranian economy started to crack under the pressure. Revenue dried up, foreign reserves dropped. But Mosaddegh didn't blink. President Truman's administration wasn't on board with overthrowing Mosaddegh at first. Truman actually met with him personally. But when Eisenhower took office in early 1953, the mood in Washington shifted completely. Britain played its most effective card, arguing that Mossadegh's weakened government might open the door for Iran's Communist Tudeh Party to take power, and Iran would become a Soviet foothold in the Middle East. Eisenhower listened and approved the plan. Operation Ajax was set in motion. The man running it on the ground was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., a senior CIA officer and grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. He slipped into Tehran quietly and began building a network of bought politicians, military officers, religious leaders, and journalists. An initial budget of $1 million was approved in April 1953, to be used however necessary to bring Mosaddegh down. What followed was as dirty as it gets. Newspapers on the CIA and MI6 payroll ran daily attacks on Mosaddegh, calling him a communist, mentally unstable, a puppet of the Soviets. Hired thugs caused street violence, sometimes disguised as Mossadegh supporters, to make his government look chaotic and out of control. The British went further. Mossadegh's chief of police was kidnapped and murdered. His body was dumped in the open for people to find, a deliberate signal that the government couldn't protect its own officials. On August 15, 1953, the signal went out over Tehran radio. General Nasiri, commander of the Imperial Guard, moved against Mossadegh's home, carrying royal decrees that the CIA had helped draft. One dismissing Mossaddegh, one appointing a new prime minister. But Mossaddegh had been tipped off. His forces fought back. The operation collapsed. The Shah panicked, fled the country, first to Iraq and then to Rome. Mossaddegh declared the coup had been crushed. He told his supporters to stand down. Things seemed to quiet. But Kermit Roosevelt was still in Tehran, and he still had money. August 19, 1953, Round 2. Crowds flooded out of the poor southern neighborhoods of Tehran, paid to show up. They chanted pro-Shah slogans, attacked government offices, stormed the National Radio building. Military tanks, whose commanders had been bought weeks earlier, rolled out into the streets, heading toward Mossadegh's residence. Street fighting tore through Tehran for hours. Around 300 people died. Mossaddegh escaped from his surrounded home, but turned himself in the next day. He was arrested, tried, sentenced to 3 years in solitary confinement, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest until his death in 1967. Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi flew back to Tehran, smiling, with CIA Director Allen Dulles following close behind. The Shah reportedly told Roosevelt, "I owe my throne to God, my people, and to you." People who were there said that of those three, the last one was probably carrying most of the weight. Operation Ajax was the first time in history that the CIA successfully overthrew a democratically elected government. Its success became a template, used again in Guatemala the following year and in several other countries throughout the Cold War. The CIA formally acknowledged its role to the public in 2013, 60 years after it happened. But Iranians always knew. They didn't need a press release. What came after Operation Ajax was a Shah who no longer needed to care what his people thought, because he knew America had his back. SAVAK, the secret police trained by the CIA, was expanded and empowered. Politicians, intellectuals, students and dissidents were arrested, tortured and killed. The political space that had briefly existed under Mossaddegh was sealed shut permanently. The Shah lived extravagantly, through lavish celebrations to mark 2,500 years of Persian monarchy, welcomed foreign dignitaries into Tehran, while large parts of the population remained poor, far removed from the wealth that oil should have delivered. Iran's oil went back into production, this time through a new consortium. BP held 40%, American oil companies held the rest. The Shah got a better cut than before, but control of the nation's resources was still in foreign hands. History keeps asking, would Iranian democracy have survived without Operation Ajax? We can't know. What we do know is that the path chosen that day led somewhere nobody actually wanted. The anger built up from decades of British exploitation was already enormous. But after 1953, that anger had a new name to attach itself to: America. Generations of Iranians grew up knowing that their country had once stood at the door of democracy, had an elected leader, had tried to claim the basic right to its own resources, and all of it was dismantled with foreign money and a foreign plan, by the same country that told the world it stood for freedom and self-determination. What America and Britain never calculated for was this: when you crush an idea people believe in, you don't destroy the idea, you just change its shape. The dream of a sovereign Iran, one that didn't answer to anyone, didn't need anyone's approval, never went away. It just went underground. And 26 years later, it came back up in a form that nobody in Washington had seen coming. Part 5. The Fire, when rage becomes religion. There's an old saying that if you block every exit for long enough, don't be surprised when someone walks straight through the wall. For Iranians living through the 1960s and 70s, the walls were thick and everywhere. Political parties banned, opposition voices jailed, students who marched got shot, journalists who told the truth disappeared. The economy was a mess of extreme inequality, oil wealth flooding in from the 1973 price spike, but flowing mostly to the top, while ordinary people watched prices climb every week. There was one path the Shah found difficult to block: the mosque. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi had been on the throne since 1941, after the British forced his father to abdicate for being too friendly with Germany during World War II. He poured oil money into modernization: roads, hospitals, universities, factories. He opened the country to Western investment. He pushed for women's education and workforce participation. He called his program the White Revolution. But all of it happened under the iron fist of SAVAK, the secret police trained by the CIA with the authority to arrest, torture, and kill suspects with no accountability. The name SAVAK alone was enough to make an Iranian's heart stop. So the Shah's development program was essentially a gift delivered in a box locked with fear. And here's the cruel irony: the educated middle class that he built through his own modernization programs became exactly the people who could read, think critically, and clearly see the gap between the government's promises and reality. He manufactured his own opposition. In the holy city of Qom, south of Tehran, there was a religious scholar who refused to stay quiet. Ruhollah Khomeini was an Ayatollah, one of the highest ranks within Shia Islam, well known among seminary students and devout communities across the country. He began openly challenging the Shah in the early 1960s, attacking policies he saw as destroying Islam's foundations: the right of women to vote, the removal of the requirement that parliamentary candidates be Muslim, and most explosively, the granting of diplomatic immunity to American military personnel stationed in Iran. On that last point, Khomeini spoke publicly about something that landed hard with ordinary Iranians. If an American soldier killed an Iranian, he was protected. If an Iranian did anything against an American soldier, he faced American courts. The Shah had essentially traded away the sovereignty of every Iranian life. The Shah had Khomeini arrested and expelled from the country in 1964. Khomeini left with his anger intact and his voice still working. He settled in Najaf, Iraq, for 13 years, teaching in the seminary, writing, and recording cassette tapes. Here's what makes this era so remarkable. the most powerful political weapon in the world in the late 1960s and 70s was a cheap plastic cassette tape. Khomeini's voice was duplicated thousands and thousands of times, hidden inside clothing, inside bags, inside loaves of bread, passed hand to hand across every province in Iran. People listened in bedrooms, in basements, in cars parked in dark alleys. Savak could seize tapes and destroy them, but they couldn't arrest a voice. And what Khomeini was saying on those tapes wasn't just religious teaching. He talked about the injustice that everyone could see. He talked about oil being stolen. He talked about the Shah kneeling before America. He spoke the language of ordinary people, not the language of scholars or politicians. That's where his real power came from. In October 1978, the Iraqi government expelled Khomeini at the Shah's request. He flew to the suburbs of Paris, a small village called Neauphle-le-Château, and that turned out to be the last thing the Shah should have wanted. Paris gave Khomeini direct access to the world's press. Journalists from every country made the trip to interview the old man in black robes sitting in a French meadow. His face appeared on the front pages of newspapers on every continent. His voice was broadcast directly back into Iranian homes via BBC radio. The Shah's attempt to exile him further only handed him a global platform. By late 1978, protest waves were crashing into Iran every single day. Crowds of millions moving through cities across the country. The movement had pulled together every strand of opposition: leftists, students, bazaar merchants, and devout religious communities. All of them had their own reasons to hate the Shah. All of them agreed that Khomeini was the focal point. The Shah tried everything: swapped prime ministers, declared martial law, made promises of reform. Nothing worked. He was quietly dying of lymphoma and trying to hide it from the public. His body was failing at the same pace as his control of the country. On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi boarded a plane and left Iran. He told the public he was going on a vacation. Everyone knew he wasn't coming back. The streets erupted instantly. February 1, 1979, an Air France Boeing 747 landed at Mehrabad Airport in Tehran. On board, one old man in black robes, sitting alone and completely still. When a journalist asked Khomeini what he felt returning after 15 years in exile, he gave an answer that baffled the entire Western press corps. "Nothing," he said. To anyone who had been watching this man for years, that one word told everything. He hadn't come back to celebrate, he had come back to work. Millions of people lined the roads from the airport into central Tehran. Children climbed trees to catch a glimpse of the car passing below. Women threw flowers down from balconies. February 11th, the army declared neutrality. The last remnants of the Shah's government collapsed. The Islamic Republic of Iran was born. People in the West have spent decades asking the question, how did a country full of engineers, doctors, and university professors end up choosing a religious cleric to run the government? The answer isn't really about religion. It's about options. When every secular political path was shut down, when every political party was banned, when every intellectual had been jailed or exiled, the one thing the Shah found hardest to close was the mosque. And the man who had been speaking from the mosque, on tape, in exile, in the pages of pamphlets, was Khomeini. That's not the stupidity of the Iranian people, that's the logic of people who've been boxed in until there's only one door left. In every era of history, when human beings are pushed past a certain point, they reach for the strongest thing they have. For Iranians in 1979, That thing was faith. The Islamic Revolution wasn't simply a change of government. It was the accumulated answer to everything, to every democracy dismantled, every oil barrel stolen, every signature forced, every election rigged, every student shot. And in November 1979, just 9 months after the revolution, when the United States admitted the Shah into New York for cancer treatment, Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 66 Americans hostage. It was the clearest statement Iran had ever made to the world. Chapter 1 is over. Chapter 2 just started. On November 4th, 1979, a group of Iranian students climbed over the wall of the American embassy in Tehran. 66 Americans were taken hostage. The crisis lasted 444 days. It became one of the defining images of the 20th century, and it became the lens through which the Western world has viewed Iran ever since. But for Iranians, that story didn't start on November 4th. It started with an oil concession in 1901. It started with $1 million of CIA money in 1953. It started with British tankers leaving Abadan night after night, and with an entire neighbourhood called Paper City, where workers lived without clean water or electricity, while drilling fuel that powered another country's economy. When the world asks how Iran became the country the West fears most, the most honest answer isn't about Iranian nature or Iranian religion. It's about a century of decisions made by other people that shaped the only options Iranians had left. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the moment that decades of compressed pressure finally exploded all at once, like oil that had been pushed down for too long and had nowhere left to go. The early leaders of the Islamic Republic knew exactly what they wanted. Distance. Complete, total distance from everything connected to the Shah's era, the era when Western influence had penetrated every corner of Iranian life, when oil money flowed out to foreign companies, when Savak tortured dissidents using techniques taught by the CIA. They weren't going to ask for permission from anyone ever again. In the 1980s, Iraq, under Saddam Hussein and with significant Western backing, invaded Iran. The war lasted 8 years. The death toll on both sides ran into the millions. Chemical weapons were used against Iranian troops. Border cities were bombed flat. Hundreds of thousands of young Iranians died in the trenches. Families losing sons became so common it barely qualified as unusual anymore. And while all of that was happening, the nations that publicly declared themselves opposed to weapons of mass destruction were quietly supplying Iraq with the equipment and chemicals used to make the weapons that killed Iranian soldiers. For Iranians, this wasn't ambiguous. This was proof, undeniable, permanent proof, that in the world as it actually operates, you are on your own. No ally will stand beside you when it costs them something. No promise of international law will protect you when powerful interests point the other way. That belief has shaped every single foreign policy decision Iran has made since, including the nuclear program that the West calls a threat, and Iran calls the only deterrent they can actually trust. Think about it from where they're standing. You're a country that had its oil stolen for 50 years. Your democratically elected government was overthrown by foreign intelligence agencies. Your neighbor invaded you with the support of the same countries lecturing you about international law. You've watched what happened to Iraq and Libya when they gave up the one thing that might have made a stronger country think twice. In that situation, building a nuclear deterrent doesn't look like aggression. It looks like survival. The answer to that depends entirely on where you're standing. For the Western world, a nuclear Iran is a catastrophe that must be prevented at all costs. For Iran, being without that deterrent is a risk they've already seen the consequences of. These two positions can't easily be reconciled, and that's why the tension between Iran and the West won't go away as long as neither side is willing to sit down and listen to the full history, not just the chapter that started in 1979. Today, Iran operates under some of the most severe economic sanctions in modern history. Its currency has collapsed, inflation has spiraled, medicine and basic goods are in short supply, and the people absorbing the consequences hardest are ordinary Iranians who have nothing to do with nuclear policy or geopolitical calculations. The Islamic Republic has real, serious problems. Policies that many Iranians, especially the young, deeply disagree with. The demand for change is alive and real. Young Iranians today aren't fundamentally different from young people anywhere. They listen to music, scroll through social media, want good jobs and stable lives. But they're growing up in a country that's been economically walled off from the outside world and politically closed on the inside. That complexity doesn't fit cleanly into the dangerous rogue state framing. Iran is a society with dreams and pain and unanswered questions, not a cartoon villain on a news ticker. Go back to the beginning. The land we call Iran was once the civilization that gave the world its first written declaration of human rights. The center of science, philosophy, trade, the largest empire in history, governed not through fear, but through the radical concept that different people could live together without being forced to become the same. And here's something that tells you everything about the Iranian spirit. Every year, on October 29th, Iranians from around the world make the journey to Cyrus's tomb at Mosaddegh to honor the man who started it all. The Islamic Republic government has tried to prevent these gatherings multiple times. People show up anyway. You can't pass a law against memory. There is nothing in the DNA of the Iranian people that destined them to be the world's enemy. Nothing in 3,000 years of their history that made conflict inevitable. What shaped modern Iran wasn't their nature, it was a series of choices made by others, in London boardrooms, in Washington offices, in Oval Office meetings, where someone decided that the stability of a foreign oil supply was worth more than the democratic rights of 50 million people. History has a recurring lesson for anyone willing to pay attention. Countries that get pushed too far always find a way to push back. The French who colonized Vietnam didn't see Dien Bien Phu coming. The British who tried to control India with a whip didn't calculate for Gandhi. And the CIA officers who toppled Mosaddegh, thinking things would settle down, definitely didn't see Khomeini and the revolution that rewrote the map of the entire Middle East. Modern Iran is the accumulated result of hundreds of decisions made over a single century. Some by Iranian leaders, some by Britain, some by America, some by millions of ordinary people who walked into the streets with hearts full of both fury and hope. It's not a story where one side was completely right and the other completely wrong. It's a story about human beings making decisions from inside their own perspective, and the consequences of those decisions still echoing through every headline about the Middle East you read today. The next time you open a news article about Iran and nuclear talks, or Iran and sanctions, or Iran and the Middle East, ask yourself where that story begins. Because if it starts in 1979, you get one picture. If it starts in 1901, you get a very different one. And if it starts in 550 BC, with one man crouched over a clay map on a high plateau, dreaming of an empire that had never tried to make everyone the same, you might begin to understand why a country the world calls a threat still wakes up every single morning feeling like it's worth more than anyone is willing to admit. History isn't just the past, it's alive in the memories of people, in the anger that passes from one generation to the next, in the dreams that refuse to die, even when the buildings burn, even when the governments fall, even when the signal gets cut. History doesn't tell us who was right and who was wrong. It only tells us that every side always believed they were right. And that, maybe, is the most unsettling thing of all. See you next time.